I'm going to record for Ellie Show or whoever else might want it. Right, we are going to finish this week the source sheet. I've just been too long on this one thing, and we will move on to a new topic for next week. I'll figure out something, or if anyone has any topics that come to mind, I'm happy to adapt. I was just catching Max up. Max is joining us. Where we left off, the Rav Shagar was that he wants the individual to be very sensitive to the question of, like, does God want something from me? And he says that if you aren't asking that question of, like, is maybe God's will different from the bottom line halacha, it doesn't matter. He's not even concerned right now with how you answer that question. And right, like, ideally, the answer to what does God want should be the halacha. But if you're not asking the question and, like, without knowing in advance what the answer is going to be, then on some level you've left God out of your religious life, and it's just about halacha at that point. So with that, I want to jump into two pieces where Rav Shagar tries to sort of resolve the tension a little more between, like, being loyal to halacha and being open to revelation. And talk about how they work together. And they're both from the second volume of his Shiurim and Likutei Moharan, from his teachings on Lamed Gimel and Lamed Daled in the Likutei Moharan, respectively. And in both of them, like, it's much broader, different topics in the Shiurim writ large, but they both deal with this specific issue, and in context also of the idea of, like, chidushay Torah. Like, that's part of what it comes to, is if there's a tension between loyalty to halacha and loyalty to, like, prophecy, like, how does new things come up in Torah? How do you get chidushim? And so that's a little bit what he's going to talk about. So let's jump right in here and share my screen. We're going to source number 7 here. So he says, when Rabbi Nachman expresses the view that it's possible to create God's will, he's not aiming for a religious reform that would enable a person to get rid of Torah and mitzvot for the sake of the individual's will to do other things. Right? So Rabbi Nachman himself talks about the idea that you can sort of create Torah. That's what it means to create God's will. You can create ratzon, that you can, it's chidushim. You can have this new idea that comes in some sense from within the individual, and that, like, is something other than what was already Torah. But for one possibility of thinking about this idea is that it is limited, is that it is not the ability to get rid of Torah and mitzvah for the sake of the individual to do other things. So what does that look like? He says what he's doing is giving the individual the option of holding on with all his strength to the truth in the depths of his soul, to follow it all the way through to the end, because this truth and the will that flows from it are a divine revelation. So the first thing to do on some of those is to distinguish between like, oh, so I stam want something, right? I just sort of have this desire I don't want to follow Torah, like the technical porek ol, right? I'm throwing off the yoke of Torah just for some random whim or desire. And the other possibility, like the more deeper thing, is that this truth in the depths of his soul, the idea that you might have some real revelation within you. And so part of what Rav Shagar wants us to be able to do is, like, ask that question, like, what is will and like truth from within your soul on the deepest level, and what's just something I want in this moment. And with repeated reference to the Ishbitzer, I'm mentioning that this is the Ishbitzer's idea of birur. Ishbitzer thinks that you can have this exact experience of, like, I know in the depths of my soul I'm supposed to do this thing, even though it goes against halacha. But the Ishbitzer says you have to, like, any emotion you have, any feeling you have, even if it seems like a good one, you have to be willing to question where it comes from and clarify, is it really, like, coming from God in the depths of my soul, or is it just like social pressure, or I want something, or whatever. The idea underlying Rabbi Nachman's words, that it's impossible to separate the Torah from a person's inner will, meaning that Torah is not necessarily halacha, which has been imposed on a person. Torah, in the deepest sense, always will align with a person, and that therefore when your inner will says something, and it really comes from deep within you, and it requires really deep honesty here, but that, like, you have to be honest and ask yourself, is this truly something that I think is real and important, and is not simply like social pressure or in some immediate whim, 1 second, Charlie, then it's sort of by definition Torah, according to this reading of Rabbi Nachman. Charlie, yeah.
So to ask the, I think, obvious but also absurd question, what would Rav Shagar respond to a Talmud who comes up to him and says, I've been thinking on it for months, and the inner depths of my soul tell me that the only way to connect to nature is to eat pig. But there's something about a pig that connects very deeply to who I am as a human being, and that's really like the inner ratzon in me. Obviously, I can't imagine that Rabbi Nachman, that Rav Shagar would permit such a thing, but I'm not sure how he would respond.
So there's a couple of possibilities. One, so I'm going to see if it's down here. Yeah, so the one possibility is he would say basically like either you do what you have to do and like be open to the consequences. So there was a piece, here's a piece that we saw. He talks about how people are not willing to pay the price of revelation. That on some level, halacha isn't just about like this is how we serve God. It's also a social thing. It's how we as the Jewish people serve God. And when you are willing to follow your own personal like revelation, you can realize that's going to have like real consequences for you in within the community. So Rosh Hashanah, like in a different piece we haven't looked at, pulls together like different strands from Rabbi Nachman in this. And so like Rabbi Nachman really talks to this possibility, and he says you have to be willing to like risk, some degree of like exile for it, but also says he's a phenomenal reading of like halacha about halakhically-ordered. Like, what do you do with the fact that sometimes halacha is like someone's words are divrei Elokim Chaim, but they're not halacha, right? So you have to be willing to like accept people within society. Like this is coming back from the opposite side, not from the person who got their own revelation that's not halacha, it's outside halacha, and that it has to be honest about that. Is talking to society, talking to the Jewish people, to be willing to accept the fact that there are people who might break halacha sometimes because they really like this is what God wants to do at the moment, and you don't have to accept that. It doesn't have to, you don't have to change halacha based on that, but you shouldn't like make life hard for them.
The same extended to homosexuality?
That's a good question, and I think like there are some posting who've definitely gone in that direction. So Rav Shlomo Riskin has for years been using the category of anus, of someone who's like compelled to break halacha, for discussing homosexuality. And obviously, on some level, he's changed the definition of anus, of compelled, from what used to mean sort of external compulsion by an external force, to like internal compulsion by my nature. This is not something I could like change. So Ravini Lau has less explicitly done something similar recently, which is he's just ignored the question of like, why are people doing homosexual? And I was like, that doesn't matter. What matters is like, are they going to be part of the Jewish community or not? And that's something we as the rest of the Jewish people have a possibility of influencing. Like we can decide if we want homosexual Jews to be totally part of the Jewish community or not. And if you don't want them to, then they won't be. But like you can't decide whether or not someone's going to be gay. You can just decide if you make them feel like they have space in the Jewish community or not. So that if he doesn't actually address the underlying question of like anus or not, but that's I think fundamentally the same thing. However, it's important to emphasize Rabbi Nachman lived with a sense of belonging to Torah, and within it he found his inner truth. So this is something that we're going to see again in the next paragraph or two, that what's important for Rav Shagar is, and for Rabbi Nachman, is that one of the things that makes this possible, talking this way, and I think it's really important to realize this, is some sense of like, oh, I totally identify with Torah, right? I strongly feel like when I want something deeply, it's about Torah. It's because this is how Torah should be, or Torah needs to be in this moment. That on some level, many of us at various stages of our life, meaning I'm assuming all of us come from relatively similar backgrounds in American Judaism, in some ways are like very acculturated. We've absorbed a lot of American culture, even within Jewish communities. So one important step of sort of birur is the question of does this instinct within me come from within the like Americanness that I've absorbed, or is it from the like Torah that I've absorbed? And there is not necessarily a clear answer to that in advance, but it has to be a question that you ask very honestly. And I'll say again, like one of the things I think is very powerful about Rav Shagar, I think very important in general, is that he rarely gives clean answers, because often you have to honestly examine your life and answer for yourself. Like it's just there's often no two ways about it. That halacha is in some ways a tool we rely on so that we don't have to answer questions for ourselves. And then most of the time that's fine. But sometimes there's like really an honest question. You have to just decide for yourself. And that's what post-game do with difficult questions, right? Is they come to the point where like, oh, this could be one way or the other way, and there's not necessarily a clear answer. So I have to like figure out what makes the most sense. This is essentially what Rav Dessler is trying to get at with the Nekudat Bechira, the place of like the one point of free will, which is that most of the time you don't have, you've just experience tells you what to do, but sometimes you have to be really honest. And it's like figure out what you think is right in the moment. And it's just, there's no two ways about it. On the one hand, we are born into the reality of tradition, halacha, and Torah. On the other hand, the Torah itself legitimizes renewal based on inner truth, which is the only possibility for reaching the service of God. And that's obviously a lot in that phrase. The Torah itself legitimizes it. We have to go into both the piece in Rabbi Nachman, this is on Torah Lamed Daled, and in the rest of Rav Shagar's teaching there to unpack that. So we're not going to do that now. Living between these two poles demands that a person find his spiritual world, locate his level, his faith, and tries to understand what God wants from him, what his unique tikkun is, what is personal truth. What is personal truth, right? You have to ask these questions like, who am I? How did God make me in this world? Who, like, in what ways has God decided I should exist and shaped me? According to Rabbi Nachman in this teaching, he doesn't worry that this personal search will lead a person away from Torah and tradition. The assumption is that someone who learns Torah will find his spiritual world within it and will, of course, feel a sense of identification and belonging. Obviously, in practice, if contradiction between a person's inner world and Torah were to develop, he must sacrifice his own will. However, this is only a theoretical possibility where such contradiction could not manifest. So this is like one way of resolving this, sort of heading before, is that it's possible to say that really if you end up contradicting the Torah instead of just being mechadeh, instead of making a chiddush, then you haven't done enough birur, right? There's a Rav Shagar doesn't conclude this in the next piece. I read both these pieces because he gives different answers in them. But one possibility is that this is mostly sort of theoretical. The question of like Avera Lishma. Avera Lishma is there to tell you you have to be asking these questions honestly. But then the ultimate truth is that because we know that we can absorb so much from the external world and from wherever into our sort of subconscious, that you can't actually you can't actually have any sort of true revelation that is not from Torah. That any sort of that contradicts Torah. You can have a true revelation within your soul that gives you a chiddush of Torah. You can make chiddushim, but they're not going to be they're not going to contradict Torah. They're not going to be a Avera Lishma. So I want to do the second piece quickly, so we'll be done shortly. In this first section, he begins to talk about the idea that there's a social aspect to halacha, and that the idea of wanting to be acceptable to people. However, connecting intimately with God really requires breaching boundaries. You have to be willing to be poretz geder. You can't stay within the well-mannered, normative, the familiar, and the self-evident. Despite the negative way the religious world looks at this sort of rebellious assertiveness, it can, in certain contexts, require a religious act of submission, no less intense than required by simply obeying halacha. And that's something I think is important to think about as well, is that it's often, this is part of why I started this half of the source sheet with Tanur Shalachnai, is often framed as like, oh, either you submit to halacha or you follow your own desires, right? Whereas like modern Orthodox people who in some degree are very much guided by Rav Soloveitchik, he emphasized submission in many of his later writings, and his students really made a sort of whole ethos out of it. And Rav Shagar is not disagreeing with submission as a religious value here. But he's saying that it's not like obvious to say submission means following halacha. If you were to receive or feel you had received some like truth that you knew in this case you had to do something different, then submitting to that is no less intense than submitting to halacha. Like one way of understanding birur is that, like in this, going back even to the Ishbitzer, is that you really feel like, oh, it makes no sense that I have to do this thing, but I just tell I'm supposed to do it. I might even like totally not appeal to me. I just feel like I just know I need to do this. Because I keep appealing to the Ishbitzer, I should note that his student Rav Tzadok basically didn't believe you could ever do birur. He believed everything the Ishbitzer believed, with like this separation between God and God's will and halacha and things, but thought you could never actually reach the point of certainty about it. And Rav Shagar himself goes back and forth in that question of can you achieve certainty. One of his students, Yishai Mavorach, really interesting thinker, is very much on the Rav Tzadok side of there's never any sort of certainty. So that would like in practice maybe lead to never like following this, even though you believe it does make sense, this sort of in terms of emunah and hashkafa and theology. This act is really quite difficult because this sort of overcoming clashes with the Torah's social aspects. When a person is loyal to his radical faith, he's likely to pay a heavy social price. This is exactly why the act requires overcoming your yetzer. You must overcome the yetzer for kavod as well as your self-image, which is a part of a kavod, right? Emphasizing that one of the reasons, one second, Charlie, one of the reasons that we keep halacha is fundamentally social, right? This is where social orthodoxy comes from. But Rav Shagar's point on that level, some level, is that like the social aspect of it doesn't just permeate like people who explicitly don't believe in God. It permeates people who just don't think about God ever, right? That God is not part of their maintaining halacha, and therefore God's also never part of the question of like should they keep halacha or not. When they ask should they keep halacha or not, it's about what they've been trained to do socially. I'm going to read to the end, Charlie, and then get to your question. Sorry, I just want to do this. Rabbi Nachman connects the illumination of the letters and the revelation of the Torah to observing the 613 commandments. The religious way of life provides the sensibility and spiritual inspiration that can enable meaningful renewal. So regards anchoring this moment of nevuah, revelation, within mitzvot and like an observant way of life. Only when you actively live a way of life shaped according to the mitzvot does Jewish religious language have meaning. And only then is it possible to innovate new concepts within this language. We can only have chidushim in Torah from within Torah. Rabbi Nachman's words point in two directions. The first is to revitalize halacha through religious radicalism, and the second is to give the renewed religious structure the halachic platform on which to rest. Without the halachic mindset, the most you end up with is a weak sense of freedom. I'm going to start with this last line and then go back to the two options here. Without the halachic mindset, the most you end up with is a weak sense of freedom, right? We talk about this tension between nevuah and halacha, but on this sort of structure, without halacha, nevuah is just sort of doing random things that God tells you to do, which is, on some level fine, but doesn't give them any context, right? They're not meaningful. Prophets in Judaism are always sent to the people, right? Nevuah always has a social context. So if you feel like God wants you to save this non-Jew on Shabbat, even though it's against the sort of strictest line of halacha, then that's a Jewish act, assuming you're doing it within the context of halacha. Even breaking halacha is on some level a Jewish act. Avera lishma is a Jewish way of putting the idea of saying I'm going to go do something else. And so this is why Rav Shagar wants to anchor this whole idea within, observing the 613 commandments, within the religious way of life. That we can, he says that whether or not you take this idea like to the level of practice, that it ends up leading you to break halacha, you have to be coming from within a Jewish way of life. Because then if you do end up sort of having a chiddush, whether that chiddush breaks halacha or not, then it's a chiddush of Torah, right? If you just have like a revelation totally disconnected from the world of Torah, then it's not chiddushei Torah, it's just something else entirely. So being anchored within the like tradition of Torah, within the like social and historical context of the Jewish people, is what defines the inner truth that wells up within you. So the first he says, I'm almost done here. The first he says is to revitalize halacha through religious radicalism. That if you're willing to or able to, on specific moments, follow what you know to be true, then that can lead to like a chiddush that becomes an important part of the Jewish, like the Jewish society. On some level, this is like how I understand every time that you find poskim justifying what the Jewish people are already doing. Is they felt like, look, I can't find a basis for this in Torah, but it makes sense to me that this has to be true. And the second is to give the renewed religious structure the halach platform which to rest. You're saying that nevuah, that new chiddush that you create, can rest within halacha and build on halacha instead of being some sort of free-floating thing on its own. Charlie, you got a question?
Yeah. To what degree do you think Rav Shagar's perspective here is reflective of the fact that he, to many, was a controversial, radical sort of Jewish mind, and therefore, obviously, going against perhaps the social wave?
Yeah, so I think it's hard to tell what came first, sort of a cyclical thing. He speaks about radicalism because he's radical, or he's a radical because he speaks about radicalism. But he really definitely does believe that truth can contradict society and put you at odds with society, and that's like almost the definition of radical in some ways. So he wants to be aware of that and thinks that like, on some level the deepest Torah comes in that way, and it's also definitely something in Rabbi Nachman. Rabbi Nachman talks about like he was only able to reach the dargot, the levels he reached because of the attacks on him by other religious leaders. Yeah, Uri.
I mean, isn't this kind of similar to the way like the Rambam sees the development of Torah Sheba'al Peh, and the fact that like, I mean, I heard a shiur by Ari Bergman that he defined kind of like tradition, I mean like orthodoxy, right, as this like being conforming to like a certain doctrine, but there's an additional element in Judaism of innovation. But that innovation only works like if it's within the system of halacha. Like, wouldn't that be like what this is, and then not that radical?
Yeah, so it depends again, like how much. In Rav Shagar himself, like I think he never explicitly comes down to say, "Oh, you can break halacha." So he keeps sort of pushing that direction and then backing up to say it has to be sort of within halacha, within halacha context. We had a little bit how much you want to lean into, like, oh, you can be breaking halacha. Yeah, any other questions? One thing, just because you mentioned the Rambam, I'll actually note he actually does discuss like a very early Shema in Shmona Prakim at the end of the fifth parak of his introduction to Pirkei Avot. So I wonder if Bergman mentioned that, but it's worth looking at. It's an interesting text. Yeah, so with that, next week we'll start a new topic. If anyone has any topics, you're welcome to put it in the group chat, or you're welcome to add Max to the group chat, or whoever one of the admins are, you can add him. Otherwise, I'll figure something out and send you guys some options during the week. All right, thank you guys.